1. Hey friends, tonight, let's explore a time when royalty didn't just wear silk or drink from golden goblets. They also kept squirrels in their sleeves. Yes, you heard that right. Tonight you're going to curl up in bed and listen to tales of furballs, with VIP access to castles' courtrooms and royal lapel pins. You might think you're tucked in comfortably now, but in the Middle Ages, you'd probably be lying next to a tiny, twitchy companion in your hooded cloak, and if you sneezed, they'd squeak. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm curious who else is listening with their own squirrel sidekick. Turn down the lights, perhaps start a fan to create a soothing ambiance, and join me as we slowly dive into tonight's story. You're walking through a dim medieval hallway lined with tapestries, but one of them moves. You lean in, and a fluffy red squirrel pokes its head out from a slit in the embroidered velvet. It's not a mistake. This isn't a dusty rat making a wrong turn. It's a squirrel, and it belongs there. In fact, it might belong more than you do. Back in the 12th to 14th centuries, squirrels, especially the red Eurasian ones, weren't just wildlife. They were domesticated darlings, courtiers of the cuddliest order. Royal children played with them. Queens tucked them into cloak linings, and courtiers even commissioned embroidered pouches with little breathing holes just for their squirrel companions to peek through during long banquets. Practical? No. Adorable? Excessively. The Anglo-Norman elite adored their squirrels the way modern influencers love teacup dogs, except with fewer dog spas and more nut-filled pockets sewn into ceremonial robes. The squirrel wasn't just cute, it was a status symbol. If your tunic bulged slightly near the shoulder, no one would dare point it out. They knew there was probably a noble squirrel resting its noble paws on your noble collarbone. Who could question that? One of the most charming examples comes from a surviving inventory list from a 13th century French noblewoman, which describes a robe de soie bleue avec pochette à écureuil. That's right, a blue silk robe with a squirrel pocket. Functional fashion before it was cool. But it wasn't only about companionship or warm shoulder fuzz. These squirrels often had names like Perlinet Chouchou or Ausselin, and they were treated not so differently from small children. Some were fed pomegranate seeds by hand. Others had tiny collars of gold or embroidered cloth, and a few were even included in portraits, often tucked inside the folds of their human's clothing, with only a curious little eye and whiskered nose peeking out. It's the medieval equivalent of putting your pet in a holiday Instagram post, except your portrait takes 4 months to paint, and you're probably sitting still the entire time. And don't forget, in a drafty, unheated stone castle, a squirrel was more than decoration. It was a mobile heating unit, snugly compact and nut-powered. Who needs central heating when you have squirrel fur muffling your chest? But here's where it gets a little more bizarre. Some squirrels were trained to respond to whistles or finger snaps like a slightly more chaotic, furrier version of a trained falcon. There are reports, albeit possibly exaggerated, of squirrels leaping between shoulders in courtly halls like acrobats in tiny red pajamas. Were they really that obedient? Probably not. But in a time when entertainment was limited to lute ballads and political gossip, you took your thrills where you could find them, even if it was just watching a squirrel successfully steal a fig tart during supper. Now, while today, you might think of squirrels as erratic, scatterbrained creatures with no real direction in life, kind of like your New Year's resolutions, medieval folks thought differently. They saw a creature of energy, cleverness, and untiring industriousness. And there's even a moral twist: a squirrel could symbolize the virtuous life. In some medieval bestiaries, those charming books of animals with bonus life advice squirrels represented the idea of preparedness, of storing for the future. So when you carried one on your tunic, it wasn't just for company. It whispered, "Look, I'm organized. I have a plan. I store acorns and secrets." But of course, not all were impressed. One 14th century bishop reportedly banned the presence of squirrels in the cathedral cloister, calling them creatures that invite vanity and itching. He might not have been entirely wrong on the itching part. Still, there's debate among scholars about whether this was a hygiene concern or just jealousy that his robes didn't come with marsupial add-ons. And here's your curious side note of the evening. During a royal procession in 1297, the young Prince of Wales's squirrel escaped its pouch mid-march and scampered onto a ceremonial table. The squirrel reportedly knocked over a goblet of wine and promptly tried to bury a grape in the Queen Mother's hat. This is considered one of the earliest recorded disruptions of a formal court event by a non-human, non-hawk animal. The chronicles say the prince cried, the Queen Mother shrieked, and the squirrel was rescued with dignity by a squire of low birth. The squire was later gifted a new cloak and a loaf of bread. The squirrel, we assume, got the grape. Of course, all of this opens a soft little door into a very fluffy academic debate. Were these squirrels truly pets in our modern sense, or were they living accessories, symbols of grace and leisure, not unlike the way a certain type of person today might walk around with a designer dog in a handbag and not let it touch the ground? Historians are divided. Some say they were deeply loved companions. Others say they were glorified brooches with pulse. You lie there now, maybe wondering what it would feel like to drift off with a squirrel tucked under your chin, its tiny claws gripping the edge of your blanket, snoring very quietly. Would it be comforting or unnerving? Here's one way to think of it. In a world without central heating scented candles or teddy bears, a squirrel was warmth motion and something soft that loved almonds as much as you do. And if it made the court look twice and whisper with admiration, even better. Oh, and one more thing. If you're ever invited to a medieval-themed party and you're asked to bring your +1, just remember a squirrel in a velvet sleeve is technically formal wear. 3 soft chuckles for the road. If you name your squirrel Sir Nibbles, don't be surprised when he insists on dining on the royal tablecloth. Medieval squirrels didn't pay rent, but they absolutely owned the castle. And no hiding snacks in your shirt does not make you a noble, unless you're a squirrel. You're waking up in a drafty stone tower, the kind with cold floors and even colder breakfasts. Someone outside is ringing a bell for morning prayers, but inside your chamber, something tiny and fuzzy is already wide awake. Your squirrel, perched proudly on the bedpost, like it owns the place. Which, let's be honest, it kinda does. Today's mission: Let's figure out why medieval folks didn't just adore squirrels, they turned them into moral teachers. You might think a squirrel is just a jittery fluffball obsessed with nuts. But in the 12th century, that fluffball was a symbol of hard work, foresight, and maybe even chastity. Bet you didn't see that one coming. In the world of medieval Christianity, animals weren't just background noise. Every creature had a meaning. A lion symbolized Christ, a dove stood for peace, and a squirrel, well, depending on who you asked it, represented a monk's ideal daily planner, busy, efficient, slightly twitchy. Bestiaries, those lavishly illustrated medieval books that combined natural science with life lessons, often portrayed squirrels as moral examples. One version from the 13th century describes squirrels as creatures that diligently store for winter and avoid the temptations of sloth. That's right, sloth. Not the animal, the sin. Imagine being a hardworking squirrel and getting eternal credit just for preparing snacks ahead of time. And let's talk visuals. These bestiaries didn't just say things, they showed them. You'd find pages where a squirrel clutches an acorn while balancing on a tree branch with an elegant caption, like "This small beast, though humble, is ever ready for cold times, and so shall man prepare his soul." Very poetic, very Pinterest board, if Pinterest had been run by monks with a flair for animal symbolism. Some texts went even further. In one Franciscan sermon, preserved in a dusty Latin scroll translation, courtesy of very tired grad students, the preacher compares the squirrel's modest hoarding to a good Christian spiritual preparation. Basically, your relationship with God should look a lot like a squirrel's pantry, full organized and slightly buried. But the symbolism didn't stop at sermons. Church architecture from the late Middle Ages occasionally included carved squirrels along choir stalls or in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. They were never center stage, but they were there perched near the corners, climbing vines or peeking out from behind holy figures, almost like they were saying, "Yes, I'm watching. Are you being diligent?" Of course not. Everyone agreed on what squirrels meant. That's where it gets a bit academic. Some scholars argue that the squirrel represented gluttony, especially in German regions, where hoarding food was seen as selfish rather than wise. Others suggest the squirrel's secretive habits, running, hiding, burying things, were a metaphor for deceit. It's all a matter of interpretation, kind of like how some people think pineapple on pizza is genius, and others think it's a culinary sin. There's even one manuscript where the squirrel appears next to a fox in a sort of woodland moral standoff. The fox tries to steal the squirrel's nuts, and the squirrel in full warrior pose defends its stash. The lesson: be like the squirrel, protect your treasures, both worldly and spiritual. Or maybe it's just medieval fan fiction. Honestly, hard to tell sometimes. And here's a fun little sidebar for your sleepy brain. In one monastery, the friars reportedly kept a tame squirrel in the cloister garden as a living allegory. Visitors were told the squirrel was a reminder to remain vigilant and gather spiritual nourishment. According to one chronicle, the squirrel's name was Lucius, and it had its own carved wooden nest near the herbs. No word on whether Lucius knew he was a metaphor or just thought he lived in squirrel heaven. So let's step back and appreciate this medieval. People saw animals everywhere, not just in the fields or forests, but in their stories, their sermons, even their furniture. And they didn't just admire them, they gave them jobs. Your squirrel wasn't just your cuddle buddy. It was a tiny, bushy-tailed life coach. Hoard your virtues. Defend your soul. Chew nothing you can't swallow, spiritually speaking. Modern life might not feature moral squirrels carved into your coffee table, but the lesson kinda sticks. Prepare for hard times. Don't slack off. And maybe keep a few extra snacks around. Just in case. Oh, and let's not ignore the sheer contradiction here. A creature seen as morally upright also regularly chewed through royal drapes and stashed apple cores in someone's ceremonial shoes. But hey, humans are full of contradictions too. Why shouldn't our tiny mascots be the same? 3 chuckles before you doze. If your spiritual guide has paws and a nut obsession, you're either enlightened or in a Pixar movie. Medieval squirrels were symbols of virtue. Modern squirrels mostly symbolize bad decisions near power lines. The only creature more judgmental than a monk, a squirrel staring at you from the edge of your lunch. You're standing in front of a tall gilded mirror somewhere inside a chilly castle chamber. A handmaiden brushes off your shoulders and asks with a completely straight face, "Shall I arrange the squirrel now, milady?" And you still, only half awake from your lavender-scented nap nod with royal confidence. Yes, the squirrel must match the hat. Obviously. Because welcome to the fashion moment of the Middle Ages, when living accessories weren't metaphorical. Squirrels, in all their twitchy, bright-eyed glory, weren't just companions or moral allegories. They were statement pieces. And if your outfit didn't match your squirrel's fur, darling, you weren't dressed at all. In the 14th century, the aristocracy didn't just want luxury. They wanted movement, texture, a touch of wildness. Enter the red squirrel with its soft belly fur, twitching nose, and natural flair for drama. Wealthy ladies began wearing special cloaks with built-in slits near the neckline or breast area just large enough for a curious squirrel to peek through and make occasional eye contact with horrified courtiers. There are records of gowns designed with squirrel perches, little embroidered shoulder pads with extra padding so your pet could rest comfortably while you dined, danced, or judged a poetry competition. A few of these gowns even had detachable hoods shaped like squirrel nests. Because why just wear fur when you can host it? It wasn't just for women either. Young lords, especially those in France and Burgundy, sometimes tied small cages to their belts, each housing a single red squirrel. The cages were made of polished birch or woven silver wire and decorated with tiny heraldic motifs. The squirrel might ride quietly as its owner walked the garden paths, or it might chew through its cage mid-ceremony and leap onto a passing priest. It's medieval fashion, always a gamble. And when the squirrels weren't alive, they were still present. Squirrel fur, called vair in medieval French, was a luxury fabric made by sewing together pieces of belly fur known for its subtle blue-gray sheen. Vair became so prestigious that it appeared in heraldry, literary symbolism, and even royal marriage contracts. And if the word vair sounds familiar, well, some believe that when Cinderella's slipper was translated into French as pantoufle de verre, someone later misread it as verglas. So yes, your favorite fairy tale might have started with squirrel belly slippers. Now, not everyone approved of squirrel-based fashion. One grumpy monk from the 1300s, writing in an exceptionally tight Latin script, complained that the ladies of court now parade with creatures upon their persons as if Eden had burst open its gates and loosed its vermin into banquets. Strong words. But to be fair, the same monk also hated pickled onions and rhyming prayers, so we're not entirely sure he was a fun guy. Still, there was real social meaning in squirrel wearing. Fashion historians now suggest that live animals on garments signaled wealth, leisure, and a certain playfulness. Unlike falcons, which showed power, or dogs which showed loyalty, squirrels suggested a kind of curated whimsy. Look, you seem to say, I control chaos. It fits in my sleeve. And here's the weird little footnote you didn't expect: some squirrel owners actually dyed their pets. Using berry juice or saffron water, a few court ladies experimented with tinting their squirrel's fur to match a dress or veil. This, as you can imagine, went over poorly with the squirrels. But apparently, the results were fashionable enough to be mentioned in court poetry, including a line that translates roughly as "her blush no brighter than the fur that slept beside her cheek." It was all about cohesion, balance. You, your gown, your scent, sachet, your jewelry, and your squirrel, all one harmonious ensemble. And if the squirrel chewed a hole through your veil during Mass, well, that's just part of the drama. Fashion hurts, darling. Today, you might see someone in a bold outfit and say, that's a look. In the Middle Ages, they'd say, that's a look, and it's breathing. Which brings us to a soft academic debate that drapes gently across centuries. Were squirrels really treated as pets, or were they objectified into fashion items? Some argue the presence of custom cages and fur-matching cloaks shows a troubling degree of control. Others say that the bond between nobles and their squirrels was genuine, like a wearable friendship. Maybe it's both. A little love, a little vanity, a lot of acorns. You can almost imagine the scene: a firelit great hall, nobles gathered for an evening ball, velvet rustling and music echoing, and in the quiet corner a squirrel naps, curled up on the collar of a duchess's embroidered dress. No one finds this strange. No one even blinks. So if you're lying in bed tonight, wondering whether your wardrobe is complete, just remember, somewhere in a 14th century portrait, a lady is wearing a squirrel as confidently as you wear socks, and she's judging you just a little. Now, your 3 sleepy chuckles before we drift off. What are you wearing tonight? Mostly, confidence, and a squirrel named Buttons. If your accessories need feeding twice a day, congrats, you're either medieval royalty or a very tired fashion student. Don't let your squirrel out during the sermon was actual advice in some court etiquette guides. Honestly, still good advice today. You're sitting in a rose garden, the kind with carefully trimmed hedges, fountains that don't quite work, and a view of the moat that somehow smells faintly of cinnamon. A lute is playing softly nearby. A nobleman in a doublet approaches, looking slightly nervous. He bows, clears his throat, and presents you not with a bouquet, but with a squirrel, wearing a tiny ribbon around its neck. Ah, medieval courtship, so subtle, so dignified, so full of squirrels. Long before chocolate boxes and awkward text messages, gifting a live animal was one of the most romantic gestures you could make if you had status and taste and the right species. Falcons, sure. Dogs, definitely. But if you really wanted to signal your affection with a wink and a whisper, nothing beat the intimate chaos of a pet squirrel. Why? Because it wasn't just a gift, it was a promise. I think you're the kind of person who can handle adorable unpredictability. There are actual surviving love poems from the 13th and 14th centuries where nobles refer to their beloveds as keepers of my heart and my squirrel. That wasn't code. It was literal. The nobleman had entrusted his precious little companion to someone else, and in return expected affection, loyalty, and probably a supply of hazelnuts. And it worked both ways. Ladies too gifted squirrels to potential suitors or friends. A Flemish noblewoman once sent her cousin in Paris a box with 2 velvet gloves, a pair of perfumed socks, and a red squirrel named Clemence. According to the attached note, the squirrel chirps in the morning and makes soft company at dusk. That's more romantic than most modern dating apps, honestly. Of course, not every squirrel gift went according to plan. There's a rather funny record from the court of Edward II in England. A young page, eager to impress a noblewoman, tied a silk ribbon around the leg of his squirrel and tried to present it mid-dance. Unfortunately, the squirrel panicked at the music, leapt onto a table of pastries, and launched a cherry tart into the lap of a bishop. The page was mortified. The noblewoman reportedly laughed so hard she nearly fainted. The squirrel was unharmed, though it refused to wear ribbons ever again. This wasn't just whimsy. These acts of gifting squirrels signaled trust. You couldn't give just anyone a squirrel. They required care, attention, and gentle hands. Letting someone look after your squirrel was like giving them the key to your diary, your pantry, and your emotional support system, all in one. In some noble households, squirrels even had little engraved tags tied to their collars like medieval air tags, but cuter. These tags might have the giver's initials, or even a short line of verse like, "If lost, return to the one who loves most dear." One well-documented example comes from the court of Burgundy, where a squirrel named Pippin had a tag that read, My heart follows, where I am fed, but my soul belongs to the lady in blue. That lady in blue. She was apparently the Duchess's niece, and rumor has it the squirrel lived longer than her first marriage. And the poetry, oh, the poetry. Squirrels show up in love ballads with phrases like, her fingers soft as fur, or her gaze bright as the eye of her tame beast. One particularly dramatic troubadour compared his beloved's laughter to the chitter of a squirrel in spring, which may not sound flattering now, but at the time was peak romantic metaphor. It wasn't all sunshine and squirrel kisses, though. Gifting a squirrel had political weight, too. A squirrel from one court to another could symbolize alliance flirtation, or sometimes a subtle insult. There's a record of a minor noblewoman sending a plump, sleepy squirrel to her rival, with a note that said, "May this mirror your ambitions." Ouch. All of this opens up an oddly charming debate among medieval scholars. Was gifting a squirrel the equivalent of giving your crush a mixtape? Or was it more like letting them borrow your dog? Was it a sign of flirty affection or full-blown romantic commitment? Maybe both. Maybe it depended on whether the squirrel was well-behaved or if it had a reputation for chewing through curtains. You lie there now, blanket pulled up just under your chin, imagining someone handing you a tiny squirrel as a gesture of love. It blinks up at you. You blink back. It makes a faint purring sound. Or maybe it's just the wind. Either way, you're smitten. Congratulations, you're now in a relationship with both the sender and the squirrel. 3 fuzzy chuckles before dreamland. Roses are red. Violets are blue. Here's a squirrel. I guess I like you. If someone gifts you a squirrel today, marry them or block them, no in between. Nothing says, I love you, like a tiny mammal with a collar more expensive than your shoes. You're standing in the great hall of a castle, banners fluttering trumpets, humming, and everyone trying really, really hard to look serious. It's a royal christening, or maybe the investiture of a new knight. No one's quite sure, because the scent of incense has made everyone a little dizzy. Dignitaries murmur Latin. A choir hums off-key. Then suddenly, there's a scream. Not from the queen, not from a nervous page boy, from a squirrel. A small, extremely fluffy squirrel bolts out from beneath a velvet cushion, scrambles across the ceremonial carpet, and launches itself directly onto the bishop's mitre. Chaos. Total chaos. Welcome to the moment when a squirrel nearly derailed a major royal event. Because in the delicate, over-the-top world of medieval court life, one misplaced furball could upend everything, and often did. This particular incident, recorded in fragments from the court of Castile around 1324, is known as La Interrupción de la Ardilla. That's right, it has a name. The squirrel in question, reportedly named Canela Spanish for cinnamon, belonged to the young Infanta and was supposed to be safely tucked in a jeweled box beside her. Instead, Canela made a break for it, just as the archbishop was blessing the ceremonial bread. She then proceeded to leap from cushion to cushion, trailing a tiny red ribbon and scattering rose petals like a furry meteor. Eyewitness accounts vary. One knight claimed the squirrel bit a scribe. A lady-in-waiting insisted it drank from the communion chalice. Most agree that someone fainted, possibly the Duchess, possibly the squirrel. And this wasn't a one-time thing. There are at least 3 other recorded incidents across Europe where squirrels caused minor diplomatic disturbances. In 1309, a Scottish baron's squirrel escaped during a treaty negotiation with an English envoy and chewed through a wax seal. The envoy thought it was sabotage. The baron insisted it was divine intervention. The squirrel was reportedly named Fergus and lived to the ripe age of 6. In Paris, during the feast of Saint Denis, a noblewoman's squirrel climbed a choirboy's robe during Mass. The squirrel had previously been fed wine-soaked figs, which might explain the enthusiasm. The boy shrieked, dropped a candle, and nearly set the altar on fire. The Mass ended early. The squirrel became a local legend. These episodes weren't just embarrassing, they could be political. Court ceremonies were rigidly choreographed performances meant to project power and order. A squirrel gone rogue was like a rogue emoji in a royal proclamation, deeply unsettling and slightly adorable. It reminded everyone, no matter how shiny the throne or golden the chalice, that nature, mischief, and fur had no respect for pageantry. And here's where historians get into squirrel-based theory. Was the rise of these royal mishaps the beginning of a backlash? Some argue that as squirrels gained popularity as pets, they lost their mystique. They were no longer symbols of virtue or fashion. They were unpredictable guests. And in an age obsessed with control, unpredictability had no place at the altar. One account from the Venetian court describes a failed wedding proposal where a groom attempted to impress his bride by dressing his squirrel in a tiny chainmail vest. The bride's father was horrified. "This is no way to present your intentions," he reportedly said. "We do not marry jesters." The squirrel bit someone's toe and fled into the garden. The engagement was canceled. Yet despite the occasional chaos, squirrels retained their elite charm. In some circles, a squirrel who behaved well at court was a sign of divine blessing. "He who tames the squirrel tames his own household," wrote one Saxon chronicler, possibly with tongue fully in cheek. You're lying in bed now, picturing a procession of nobles in heavy brocade, a harp playing softly, and somewhere in the mix, a squirrel riding in a carved wooden box, lined with velvet, eyeing the world with suspicious dignity. And maybe plotting its next dramatic escape. 3 final giggles before sleep. Medieval squirrels were either the life of the party or the cause of a diplomatic incident, sometimes both simultaneously. "Do not chase the queen's squirrel during Mass" was probably said at least once by a very tired monk. If your pet disrupts a royal ceremony, congrats, you've made history. Or at least a great dinner story. You're lounging on a carved wooden bench beneath a flowering arbor, sipping watered wine from a pewter cup and swatting at a fly with your embroidered kerchief. Across the garden, Lady Marguerite just released her squirrel into a hedge maze. This is not unusual. This is in fact sport. Because yes, welcome to the era of squirrel hunting, but not the rugged, muddy boots, arrow-flying kind. No, this is the gentle, ruffled version, reserved for ladies of leisure and lords too bored for bore. In some noble courts of the late 13th and early 14th centuries, hunting a squirrel meant releasing it into a curated outdoor space, usually a hedge labyrinth or small orchard, and then trying to call it back with a whistle or catch it with a gloved hand. Bonus points if the squirrel didn't bite you. Even more if it leapt directly into your arms in front of spectators. If this sounds suspiciously like an excuse to parade around in expensive capes while holding a nut, well, that's because it was. Records from the Bavarian Duchy of Landshut describe such pastimes as le jeu des écureuils, the squirrel game. Participants included noblewomen, bored clerics, and on one scandalous occasion, a visiting minstrel with a very fast squirrel named Pommy. The winner was usually awarded a ring, a ribbon, or a larger squirrel. Sometimes there was just applause and a poem, which honestly still feels like a pretty good Saturday. But let's not kid ourselves. These were competitive folks. Some families trained their squirrels for months. They used food incentives, whistles, and even scent cues. One French noblewoman supposedly slept with an acorn-stuffed pouch under her pillow to imprint her scent. Whether this worked or just attracted bugs remains unclear. Of course, not all squirrel hunts went smoothly. There's a charming disaster story from the court of Naples in which 3 squirrels released into a rose garden instead climbed the royal grape arbor and refused to come down. A ladder was fetched. The duke's nephew tried to assist. He fell into a fountain. The squirrels won. And that's part of the fun. These weren't brutal high-stakes hunts. They were a theatrical mix of elegance, affection, and chaos. A kind of medieval tag with rules that changed depending on who's watching. It gave people a chance to show off their pet's skills, their own patience, and occasionally their scream volume when a squirrel ran up their sleeve unexpectedly. Squirrel sport even made it into artwork. Illuminated manuscripts sometimes show ladies holding small leashes attached to squirrels or gently guiding them with little wands. One particularly delicate margin illustration from a 14th century psalter shows a noblewoman leaning against a tree as a squirrel springs toward her outstretched hand. The caption beneath reads, "A noble pastime full of mirth and measure," also possibly full of small bite marks. Now here's where scholars love to argue. Was this really sport, or was it more like a social dance? Some say it was designed for flirtation, a structured excuse to spend time with someone in a garden, getting lightly scratched while everyone pretended to be dignified. Others claim it was a test of temperament. Could you maintain grace poise and a gentle tone while a squirrel chewed through your sleeve embroidery? If yes, perhaps you were ready for marriage, or at least dinner with the king. We also get glimpses of competitive squirrel bragging. One nobleman wrote in a letter to his cousin mine, "Returns to me on the 3rd whistle, and climbs no servant but me." The bishop watched and nodded with approval, which translated to modern terms is basically, "My pet likes me more than anyone." The bishop knows. Interestingly, squirrel sport became briefly unpopular during a short-lived campaign in southern France, encouraging more masculine pastimes. One cleric even labeled the games frivolous, fruitless, and fur-covered. His pamphlet didn't circulate well, possibly because it was eaten by squirrels or ignored by people who preferred their entertainment full of fluff. Tonight, as you rest under the soft hum of your fan, imagine yourself in that medieval garden. The hedges rustle, laughter echoes, and you kneel gently in the grass, holding out a palm. The squirrel sees you. It hesitates, then leaps into your lap like a tiny acrobat who knows you're the one who packed the good figs. And for a moment, just a moment, you're not in the 21st century anymore. You're in the game. 3 sleepy chuckles before your next dream. If your sport requires snacks and frequent apologies, it's either squirrel hunting or dating. Training your squirrel to return on command is impressive, until it chooses your enemy instead. The only thing more chaotic than medieval squirrel games, modern toddler birthday parties. You're sitting in a small chamber lined with scrolls, the kind that smell faintly of beeswax and unresolved tension. A clerk in a tight wool tunic squints at you over a stack of parchment. He clears his throat and says without irony, "I'm sorry, but your claim to the squirrel is invalid under Clause 17. He's a gray. Only reds are permitted north of the river." Wait, what? Yes, tonight we've entered the wonderfully bureaucratic side of squirrel history because apparently, at one point in the Middle Ages, there were actual legal distinctions made about squirrels. Not all squirrels were equal. Not all squirrels were allowed. And shockingly, not everyone could just walk around with one tucked under their cloak like it was medieval Disneyland. Let's start with the basics. There were 2 major types of squirrels known to the medieval European world. The native red squirrel, small, fluffy-eared, beloved by royalty, and the larger gray squirrel, which was a later, sometimes imported species, considered more common and occasionally a bit uncouth. As squirrel ownership grew into a recognizable trend among the nobility, some cities and local manors began issuing statutes regarding the keeping, trading, or even walking of squirrels in public. And yes, squirrel laws were real. A 14th century town charter from Bruges, for instance, specifically states, "No person of lesser trade shall parade a beast of velvet tail unless in service to a lady of the cloth or court." Translation: if you weren't high-ranking or working for someone who was, you had no legal right to show off your squirrel in public. In other regions, squirrel color actually determined legal value. The red squirrel, often associated with nobility and religious symbolism, was protected under certain manorial laws. In some towns in southern Germany, there were fines for trapping or trading red squirrels without a license. Meanwhile, gray squirrels, larger, louder, and more adaptable were often considered pests, or at best woodland freeloaders. And then came the ownership tags. That's right. Some noble families began attaching little wax seals or braided silk bands around their squirrels' necks to signal ownership. One preserved example, found in a Danish monastery, reads, "Belongs to the House of Bjornstad. Do not pet without permission. A squirrel with no band. Considered wild. Or worse, smuggled." Now don't get the wrong idea. This wasn't full-blown squirrel taxation. Although now that I say that out loud, I'm shocked no one tried. But there was very real social enforcement. A merchant's apprentice caught carrying a squirrel down the main square in Rouen was once fined a whole day's wages, not because the squirrel caused harm, but because, quote, he presumed familiarity with the habits of the upper class. Even monasteries got involved. A Benedictine order in northern France famously included squirrel regulations in their kitchen codes. No squirrels in the larder, no squirrels above the bread racks, and no naming them after saints. That last part likely followed a somewhat awkward incident with a squirrel named Saint Theobald, who stole 3 communion wafers and refused to return them. And this leads us gently into a scholarly question, still discussed today. Were these laws about squirrels, or were they really about people? Some historians argue that squirrel restrictions weren't about the animals at all, but rather served to reinforce class divisions. If only nobles could wear fur and walk a red squirrel on a leash, then squirrels became symbols of control, not just over nature, but over society. It's the same logic that restricted who could wear certain colors, carry a hawk, or even ride a horse of a particular height. Others point out that many of these squirrel-related laws emerged around times of economic anxiety, when the line between nobles and wealthy merchants started to blur. In other words, if a merchant's wife starts parading around with a squirrel, how's anyone supposed to tell who's who anymore? So perhaps, in their own ridiculous, fluffy way, squirrels became battlegrounds for social identity. A red squirrel was not just a pet, it was a pedigree. You're snuggled deep now, blanket wrapped tight, wondering if your squirrel would pass the test. Would it be seen as noble, respectable, refined? Or would it be labeled unregistered and escorted from the cheese market by the town watch? 3 light-hearted legal chuckles before we snooze. I swear, "Your Honor, the squirrel isn't mine," has probably been said more times than you'd think. If your fashion pet needs documentation, congratulations, you're either a medieval noble or at an airport. When squirrels become a class symbol, you know society has truly run out of chill. You're pacing down a castle corridor lit by flickering torchlight, following the unmistakable sound of a squirrel sneezing. Yes, sneezing. You arrive at a small chamber that smells faintly of crushed thyme and fermented apple peel. A man in an oversized velvet robe greets you with a bow so deep it might be ironic. He's wearing spectacles made from 2 bottle bottoms and holding what can only be described as a walnut-sized stethoscope. "Welcome," he says solemnly. "I am physician to the squirrels." Tonight, we tumble into the oddball world of medieval animal medicine, or rather, what passed for it, and the mysterious half-legendary figure of Master Éloi de Rougemont, more commonly whispered about as Le Docteur des Écureuils, or the Squirrel Doctor. Let's set the scene somewhere in 14th century Burgundy. Nestled between superstition and science lived a man with an unusual clientele. While most healers focused on monks with fevers or knights with arrow wounds, Éloi de Rougemont, if that was his real name, became known for treating the beloved pets of noblewomen, especially squirrels. The records are slim, the details delightfully ridiculous. A single letter survives from a courtier at the time written to a cousin in Lyon. Her ladyship's companion beast fell to a grave mood. The little one ceased its acorn snapping and would not scurry. Master Éloi came with his herbs and blue salts. By the 3rd bell, the creature leapt again. It's not clear what these blue salts were. Possibly powdered woad. Possibly sugar mixed with optimism. Regardless, the squirrel felt better, or faked it to get the man out of its fur. According to later accounts, part gossip, part folklore, Master Éloi offered a range of services: squirrel massage, light tapping around the haunches, mood rebalancing through scent pouches, and a calming ritual that involved whispering Latin lullabies while swinging a pouch of warm moss. Did any of this work? No idea. But in a time when a favorite squirrel could be more emotionally important than a husband, people were willing to try anything. Éloi's reputation spread, helped along by grateful clients, and probably more than a few bored scribes. Soon, squirrels were being brought from neighboring provinces to be treated for such ailments as melancholy tail-winded twitch and the ever-feared acorn refusal. His unofficial title became Médecin de la Queue Sacrée, Doctor of the Sacred Tail. Not everyone approved, of course. One satirical verse, scribbled in the margins of a manuscript from Rouen, pokes fun at the Squirrel Doctor. He heals not men, but beasts that bite. Their teeth are sharp, their mood not right. Yet coins he takes for tail and paw. This healer breaks the natural law. Translation: this guy is weird, and he's charging too much. But the real question, historians love to argue about, is this: did Master Éloi actually exist? Or was he a caricature of quack doctors, exaggerated through gossip and bedtime stories? Some believe Éloi was a real person, maybe an apothecary with a niche market. Others argue he was a composite, a symbol of society's strange blend of affection and absurdity toward animals. In one dusty university debate from the 1700s, a professor declared, "The squirrel doctor is no more real than a polite rooster," which raises more questions than it answers. Interestingly, Master Eloy's legend outlived him. By the 15th century, the term faire les lois had popped up in French plays and tavern songs. It meant to fuss uselessly over something small like a spoiled pet or your hairstyle before meeting the Duke. It's the medieval equivalent of helicopter parenting, except with nut-stashing rodents. Still buried in the silliness is a lovely truth people cared deeply. They loved these animals enough to commission treatments, to pay coin for comfort, to believe that whispering herbs could mend a creature's broken spirit. And even if the treatments didn't work, the attention, the affection mattered. As you lie there tonight, picture a squirrel with a tiny wool blanket draped across its back, sipping warm milk from a carved acorn cup, while a velvet-clad man hums softly about digestive balance. Ridiculous, maybe. Beautiful, absolutely. 3 nutty chuckles for your dreams. If your vet wears a cape and chants in Latin, you either own a medieval squirrel or have very high pet insurance. Mood swings and acorn refusal also describes half of my Tuesdays. The only thing more powerful than medieval superstition, a squirrel with a fan club. You're seated on a cushioned bench in the corner of a noble's banquet hall where the air smells of roasted pears, beeswax, and just the faintest hint of squirrel dander. A juggler finishes his act. The crowd claps politely. Then the steward clears his throat and announces with full ceremonial gravity, "Now presenting Sir Gaspard, the acrobatic squirrel of Toulouse." And just like that, a tiny red blur launches itself from a velvet perch, somersaults through the air, and lands perfectly balanced on the edge of a pewter goblet. The room erupts in delighted applause. You blink. Did that squirrel just bow? Yes. Yes, it did. Tonight, we arrive at one of the stranger turns in squirrel history, the rise of trained squirrels in medieval courts, not just as companions, but as entertainers. It was the golden age of fluff-based performance. While we think of animal acts today as a circus staple or party gimmick, the medieval court had a soft spot for the unexpected and adorable. And nothing won over a room like a squirrel doing spins for a slice of dried fig, especially if it wore a tiny cape, which it often did. Early mentions of performing squirrels appear in royal household records under miscellaneous amusements just after jesters and before musical frogs, also a real thing. But that's for another bedtime. In the court of King Charles V of France, a jester named Raymond is noted for having trained not 1, but 2 squirrels to run obstacle courses across banquet tables. One even rang a bell with its paws. The entry includes the charming note, performed without incident, save for the sauce bowl. By the late 14th century, squirrels were being taught all sorts of crowd-pleasing behaviors, leaping through hoops, walking tightropes strung between candlesticks, and even, if you can believe it, delivering tiny scrolls tied to their tails. A trained squirrel might cost as much as a horse, but if it could pirouette, worth every penny. And yes, they bowed. The squirrel bow was reportedly achieved with a gentle tap signal and a treat reward. The trainer would snap their fingers, and the squirrel would lower its front paws and duck its head. In one banquet scene described by an Italian chronicler, a squirrel performed a synchronized bow alongside a nobleman's 5-year-old daughter. The crowd wept. The girl later married a duke. The squirrel retired with honors. Of course, training squirrels was a skill that required patience, food bribery, and a high tolerance for being bitten. Trainers, often called souriciers or tail whisperers, used whistles, clickers, and food-scented gloves. A popular treat, mulberry jelly on rose petals. And not everyone appreciated the act. A moralist monk from Aragon once complained, "In days of old beasts served only purpose. Now they serve applause. What is next? A duck to teach letters." We can't say for sure, Brother Uriel, but honestly, that sounds amazing. Here's a quirky side note for your sleepy mind in the court of Queen Isabella of Castile. A squirrel named Don Pequeño was reportedly able to distinguish between 2 different colored ribbons and retrieve the correct one on command. Whether this was due to training or luck is unclear, but the queen was so charmed she commissioned a portrait of the squirrel. Sadly, the painting no longer exists, but a letter from her lady-in-waiting describes it as a noble likeness of the beast mid-prance upon a velvet dais. That's right, mid-prance. And this naturally opens the fuzzy door to scholarly speculation. Did performing squirrels influence early theatrical traditions? Some believe these animal displays may have contributed to the rising popularity of miniature stage spectacles and moral plays with animals symbolizing virtues, vices, or occasionally just comedic timing. A squirrel who could bow on cue might be the medieval version of a visual punchline, or a very twitchy metaphor. Others argue it was pure novelty, harmless fun for bored courtiers who had already seen every lute ballad and were not yet blessed with the invention of chess tournaments involving goats. Also a thing. Again, another bedtime. As you lie there now, imagining the flickering torchlight, the rustle of silk robes, and the quiet tension before a squirrel leaps through a golden hoop, remember this. These weren't just party tricks. These were tiny, furry rebellions against boredom. A squirrel on stage was joy in motion, and for a few seconds, every head in the hall turned toward something wild, small, and entirely unexpected. 3 applause-worthy chuckles before lights out. If your talent show includes a squirrel, you've already won. The rest of us are just here for snacks. Nothing commands respect like a rodent in a cape doing better stage presence than your cousin Gregor. Please rise, for the performing squirrel is a sentence I plan to use at every future wedding. You're stepping into a medieval marketplace just as the sun hits the cobblestones and someone yells, "2 bellies of squirrel for a loaf of rye." You turn confused until you spot a merchant holding up not an actual squirrel, but 2 squares of luxuriously soft fur trimmed into neat little rectangles. It's not odd. It's currency. Tonight we unwrap the surprisingly rich history of squirrel fur as money, and specifically why the soft underbelly fur, yes, just the belly, became more than fashion. It became finance. Let's start in the north. In parts of medieval Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, especially in what is now Finland and Western Russia, squirrel pelts, particularly the smooth, silvery gray fur from their bellies, were used in trade for centuries. It wasn't just decoration. These pelts were called skin penningar, or skin pennies, and they functioned as a form of soft currency long before coins became common. The concept was simple squirrel pelts were light, durable, easy to carry, and everyone wanted them. Especially the fancy underbelly kind, which was thinner and more pliable, perfect for trimming cloaks or lining gloves. And unlike silver coins, which fluctuated wildly in value and were constantly being shaved down, or faked squirrel pelts were a tangible, snuggle-approved unit of worth. You couldn't counterfeit soft. One legal code from the Novgorod Republic in the 13th century even specifies fines in belly pelts. For example, stealing a chicken, 2 pelts. Breaking a cart, 6 pelts. Insulting a noble's beard, 8 pelts, and a public apology. And don't think this was just local barter stuff. Pelts were traded all over Europe. Merchants in London, Bruges, and Genoa were known to accept high-quality squirrel fur in exchange for spices, wine, or fine cloth. A bolt of silk from Venice might cost 60 fine bellies depending on the season. That's right. Prices could change based on squirrel supply. One cold winter in the 14th century saw a sharp drop in available pelts, and local chroniclers noted a crisis in the fur exchange, including a bishop complaining that his winter cloak lacked appropriate fluff. And here's the twist. It wasn't just about comfort or vanity. Wearing squirrel fur, especially vair, that soft blue-gray patchwork made from belly pieces, signaled wealth and connection. If you had vair, it meant you had access to fur markets, trade routes, and enough influence to avoid the cheaper furs, like rabbit or cat. Vair became so associated with status that it was literally written into sumptuary laws, regulations that told you what you could or couldn't wear based on your social class. In England, for example, a 1337 statute declared that only earls and above could wear vair on their outer garments. Others could use it as lining if they were lucky or rich enough to bribe someone. So if you walked into court swishing a cloak lined with squirrel bellies, you weren't just warm, you were making a political statement. A cozy, quiet flex. But of course, this demand created a supply problem, which led to the Great Squirrel Rush. Hunters across forests in what's now Latvia, Estonia, and parts of Ukraine started specializing in squirrel trapping. Some even formed early trade guilds with rules about pelt quality and export rights. The most prized squirrel furs had to be free of tear stains or nut rot, a curious condition caused by oily food storage, not as dramatic as it sounds. A single high-quality squirrel could be worth more than a day's wages. A bundle of 30 enough to seal a marriage alliance. In fact, there's a surviving letter from a 14th century noblewoman declining a marriage proposal, but keeping the squirrel pelts he sent. Though I do not return thy affection, she wrote, I find thy furs most agreeable. Brutal, but fair. And while today, we might cringe at the idea of animals, as currency medieval folks had a very practical approach. For them, value was in utility, and squirrels offered warmth, prestige, and tradability all rolled into one compact fuzzy package. This brings us naturally to the scholarly question of the night: was squirrel fur truly a form of money, or was it just an early luxury commodity? Some argue it had all the traits of currency: portability, divisibility, consistency. Others say it lacked standardization. Some pelts were trimmed, others dyed, and values shifted with fashion trends. But everyone agrees, for at least a few glorious centuries, squirrel bellies bought bread, bridged alliances, and wrapped royalty in fuzz. As you curl into your blankets, imagine yourself walking into a tavern and tossing 2 fine pelts on the table. The barkeep nods and slides over a hot bowl of stew and a seat by the fire. No coins, no questions, just squirrels. 3 cashmere soft giggles before we rest. Forget Bitcoin squirrel belly was the original decentralized currency. You paid how much for that cloak? 12 squirrels and a stern look from a forest priest. If your bank account ever goes soft, just hope it's at least luxuriously soft. You're strolling through the castle courtyard just as the bells begin to toll. Not for a wedding, not for a feast, for something darker. The sound echoes through the stone walls and mingles with whispers, some in Latin, some in fear. You see a servant girl toss out a pail of water, then mutter a prayer as a squirrel darts past her boot. She gasps, clutches her apron, crosses herself. The squirrel used to be a friend. Now it's a suspect. Tonight, we drift into the uneasy chapter of squirrel history, the part where fluff meets fear. Because when the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, the adorable red-furred companions of the elite suddenly found themselves under suspicion. Not for treason, not for chewing through scrolls, but for spreading disease. Let's back up. When the bubonic plague exploded across the continent starting in 1347, people were desperate for explanations. Germ theory was centuries away. Microscopes weren't a thing. and public health often meant pray harder and maybe burn something. Theories flew faster than the fleas themselves. Bad air, cursed wells, astronomical misalignment, sin, and increasingly, animals. At first, suspicion focused on rats. Understandable. But rats were everywhere and not always easy to spot. Squirrels, however, they were visible, bold, often in the home, and worse yet, beloved, which to the anxious mind made them twice as dangerous. Monks began writing cautionary notes in the margins of manuscripts, warning against keeping wild beasts within chambers of rest. A medical text from the German city of Augsburg includes a curious passage. The creature of tail and tooth, oft seen in noble homes, is quick to scratch, and may carry ill through bite or breath. That's not science, but in 1350, it felt like science. Soon stories began to circulate. In Milan, a countess reportedly fell ill after letting her squirrel sleep near her pillow. In Avignon, a merchant blamed a forest rodent for infecting his entire household, even though he also admitted to drinking spoiled wine and attending 3 crowded markets. Details. The result, a sharp decline in squirrel prestige. Pet squirrels were quietly released into nearby woods. Some were sold at roadside stalls, often with disclaimers like recently bathed or no history of sneezing. A few noble families even issued internal bans on soft-bodied companions, grouping squirrels with ferrets, weasels, and bizarrely hedgehogs. The fashion shift was swift. Squirrel fur, once prized and worn with pride, became a little too close to the source. Cloaks lined with vair were suddenly seen as risky. In places like Prague and Krakow, tailors were ordered to use alternative linings such as lamb's wool or imported rabbit. One wealthy woman allegedly had her entire winter wardrobe burned when she learned it had been lined with unclean belly pieces. Her husband reportedly wept for the cost, not the clothes. Now here's where it gets slightly absurd. Some towns tried to implement squirrel quarantines. A record from a small village near Dijon notes a holding pen for the tailed creatures located behind the chapel, where any squirrel found in a place of worship shall be held for observation not fewer than 3 days. That's right, 3 days. As if the squirrel might develop symptoms and politely report them. This moral panic didn't last forever. By the late 1300s, attention shifted back to more obvious issues: famine, political unrest, and actual rats. But the damage had been done. Squirrels never quite recovered their former status. They went from cozy lap companions to awkward historical footnotes, remembered more for their brush with scandal than their decades of squirrel gymnastics and velvet-lined glory. Which brings us naturally to a broader academic debate. Did fear of disease permanently demote the squirrel from the social elite, or was it merely a temporary PR setback? Some historians argue that the post-plague shift in pet preferences from exotic to domestic, from wild to predictable, coincides almost exactly with the squirrel's fall from grace. Others suggest it was more economic squirrel fur lost value as silk, and imported wool became more accessible. but it's hard to ignore the timing. As you rest tonight, maybe with a fuzzy blanket tucked under your chin, picture a noble lady in a dim, candlelit room, holding her squirrel one last time before opening the window. She whispers a quick apology. The squirrel blinks, then leaps into the ivy and disappears. 3 hush-toned giggles before sleep finds you. Do not kiss your squirrel became actual health advice. Medieval TikTok would have had a field day. If your pet was once accused of biological warfare, congratulations, it made more impact than your uncle's loot career. The squirrel didn't cause the plague, but it did make everyone panic while looking adorable. You're kneeling in a dim cathedral where shafts of light cut through stained glass, casting colors onto cold stone. The air smells of incense, beeswax, and old wood. Your eyes wander from angels carved in stone to a small, unexpected figure nestled near a column. A tiny squirrel carved in exquisite detail, its bushy tail curling upward like a question mark. Welcome to the curious world of squirrel imagery in medieval churches, where these furry creatures quietly shared sacred space with saints, demons, and cherubs. Well, the answer is delightfully complex. In some Christian iconography, squirrels symbolize temptation and sin the same way a snake or a fox might. Their habit of hoarding nuts was interpreted as greed or selfishness, warning the faithful against hoarding earthly goods instead of spiritual riches. A squirrel nibbling on an acorn might be a gentle moral reminder. Don't be like this creature, consumed by material desire. One famous example comes from the choir stalls of Lincoln Cathedral in England, where a series of misericords, those small carved seats designed to provide relief during long prayers, include a squirrel biting a nut, sometimes cheekily stealing from a bird or a rabbit. Scholars debate whether this was just playful medieval humor or a coded warning about pride. But squirrels also carried more positive meanings. In some illuminated manuscripts, a squirrel climbing a tree symbolized the soul's ascent or preparation for the afterlife, echoing earlier bestiary traditions that praised the squirrel's foresight and industriousness. In these contexts, the squirrel is less a sinner and more a model for spiritual readiness, packing away virtues like nuts for winter. Even stranger, some churches featured squirrels in the company of saints. One 14th century French fresco shows Saint Hubert with a stag and, curiously, a squirrel perched nearby. Some interpret this as a local folk tradition merging with church art, a nod to the natural world and its creatures as part of God's creation, both wild and sacred. And here's the delightfully odd detail. In a few rare places, squirrels appear alongside marginalia, the whimsical doodles and caricatures monks sketched in manuscript margins. These squirrels often play the role of tricksters nibbling scrolls or stealing inkpots. One marginal drawing from a 13th century psalter depicts a squirrel reading a miniature book, glasses perched on its nose. It's unclear if this was satire or just a bored monk's joke, but either way, it's a tiny moment of medieval humor preserved across centuries. The presence of squirrels in sacred spaces sparked some debate among medieval theologians. Was this an appropriate symbol? Was it too worldly? Should squirrels be chased from holy grounds like other unruly beasts? Some sermons from the period cautioned clergy against allowing animals into church sanctuaries, but squirrels often escaped blame, perhaps, due to their cute factor, or because they were seen as reminders of nature's balance. Here's a little-known legend from a German abbey. A squirrel supposedly warned monks of an impending fire by frantic chattering and running through the halls. The monks took this as a divine sign. The squirrel was later memorialized in stained glass, holding a miniature scroll reading, "Vigilance is salvation." And this brings us to a gentle, ongoing academic question. Are squirrels in churches primarily symbolic warnings about sin, or are they tender nods to the natural world and its spiritual lessons? Likely, they were both a reflection of the medieval mind's ability to see complexity in the smallest creatures. As you lie beneath your cozy blankets tonight, imagine those tiny carvings watching over the faithful, reminding us that even the humblest squirrel can carry big lessons. Maybe your dreams will find a squirrel perched on a cathedral spire, gazing out over a world full of wonder, mischief, and meaning. 3 soft chuckles for your night. Medieval squirrels part sinner, part saint all fluff. If a squirrel could give sermons, it would probably just chew the pulpit. Dear congregation, beware. The squirrel would definitely get more clicks today. You're stepping into a dimly lit workshop behind a bustling market street where the air smells of leather wood shavings and something faintly nutty. Around you, workers handle tiny cages, polish collars, and prepare bundles of squirrel pelts for the next shipment. This is no ordinary trade. It's the beginning of a whole industry, the business of breeding, raising, and managing squirrels for the aristocracy. Yes, medieval Europe had its own version of squirrel farming, though it was far from the bucolic scenes you might imagine. It was a serious, sometimes cutthroat profession, often shrouded in secrecy and superstition. Records from the Flemish town of Ghent mention guilds of écureuils, professional squirrel keepers who supplied royal courts across Europe with carefully trained animals, fresh pelts, and even specially dyed squirrels for those bold enough to try. These guilds kept tight control over breeding practices, trading only among approved members, and often regulated the types of squirrels allowed as pets versus those destined for fur. But it wasn't all business suits and peaceful breeding. Behind the velvet curtains and embroidered gloves, the industry had a darker side. Some breeders resorted to questionable methods to meet demand-trapping wild squirrels, taming them forcibly, or even conditioning them with harsh treatments to curb their natural nervousness. After all, a squirrel that bit the queen's fingers too often was a liability. A curious case comes from 14th century France, where a scandal erupted after a batch of dyed squirrels turned out to be dyed so badly that their fur fell out in patches during a royal banquet. The offended noblewoman demanded refunds and reportedly banned the breeder from court, calling the episode a betrayal of trust and fashion. It was one of the earliest known cases of animal-related consumer complaints. In some regions, the term chan sok, translated loosely as squirrel husbandry, became synonymous with both the care and exploitation of these creatures. The balance between affection and commodification was delicate. Breeders wanted healthy, lively animals, but they also needed them manageable and marketable. Interestingly, some guild documents reveal a kind of early animal welfare concern. Instructions included advice like, do not overfeed your squirrels nuts of the bitter kind and always provide a nest away from sunlight. It wasn't all exploitation. Some breeders clearly cared deeply for their charges, blending economics with empathy. Of course, this specialized trade wasn't limited to pets. The demand for squirrel pelts skyrocketed in certain decades, creating an entire secondary economy around trapping, skinning, and fur preparation. Sometimes, this led to overhunting and local squirrel shortages, which in turn triggered new laws regulating the capture and sale of wild squirrels, an early example of wildlife management. One particularly grim document from a Bavarian town details the fines imposed on illegal trappers who captured squirrels out of season or in protected forests. The penalties were steep sometimes, including public humiliation fines and confiscation of gear. And so while the courts played with squirrels as symbols of grace and whimsy, the hands that supplied these creatures often faced a harsh reality. The industry's expansion revealed the tension between seeing squirrels as royal companions and treating them as commodities. This duality mirrors a broader theme in medieval pet-keeping. Animals were both cherished friends and sources of profit. A squirrel could be a beloved lap companion one day, a pelt on a merchant's cart the next. As you nestle deeper into your blankets, consider this delicate balance, the fine line between affection and use, between wildness and ownership. Somewhere, a squirrel once balanced that line on a velvet cushion, its bright eyes unaware of the world's complicated rules. 3 gentle chuckles before sleep. Chan sok sounds fancy until you realize it means squirrel management drama. Breeders, then? Yes, our squirrels come with a satisfaction guarantee. Mostly. Nothing says medieval business like a contract specifying fur quality and bite limits. You're seated at an ornate writing desk in a tower room, quill in hand, candle flickering, and parchment spread before you. Outside, a soft wind rattles the stained glass window, but inside, your only company is the faint rustle of movement from a small basket beside the fire. You glance over. Your squirrel stirs, yawns, and curls deeper into the folds of a silk handkerchief. You smile, then return to your letter. But here's the twist. The letter is for the squirrel. Tonight, we drift gently into one of the most oddly tender corners of medieval pet culture, the world of love letters and written devotion to squirrels. Because sometimes affection went beyond cooing and nut bribing. Sometimes it took the form of ink poetry and whispered confession on paper no one else would ever see. It might sound whimsical, maybe even a little too much, but in the emotional vocabulary of the Middle Ages, pets weren't just companions. They were confidants, witnesses, occasionally soulmates with tales. One particularly well-preserved example comes from a 14th century English noblewoman, Lady Cecily of Alnwick, whose journal includes a letter addressed to her squirrel, Thimble. She writes, "My dearest friend, thy silence is not cold, for it listens deeper than most voices. When I weep, thy gaze is patient. When I wake, thou art already near. Were you able to answer, I doubt I'd require anyone else." Modern readers might see this as projection. Medieval readers might have seen it as poetry. Either way, it's incredibly touching. Another example, this time from an Italian merchant's son named Matteo, includes a short poem written to his pet squirrel, Vita. You sleep in silk, you eat with grace. No worries trouble your soft face. Would I trade my scrolls and books for your calm tale and softer looks? It's worth noting that many of these writings weren't intended for performance or publication. They were tucked inside diaries, folded into drawers, or stored with keepsakes. In a way, these letters were like prayers, quiet, personal, and deeply sincere. And in a world where emotional expression was often regulated by class, gender, and religion, perhaps a letter to a squirrel was one of the few truly unfiltered outlets available. Now, did squirrels actually understand these love notes? Highly unlikely. Though there's an adorable 13th century tale from Brittany about a squirrel who responded by pushing a walnut into its owner's slipper after being read a lullaby verse. Was it gratitude or just snack storage? Who cares? Either way, the man cried. Some letters weren't romantic, but melancholic. A few read like grief notes, written after a squirrel had died or disappeared. One nobleman wrote a eulogy in rhymed couplets for Marlequin, his pet of 4 years. No tale more proud, no leap more bold, your paws grew still, your nest grew cold. Though beast by birth, in soul, a night I weep alone, this silent night. These kinds of expressions lead us to one of the cozier scholarly debates. Were letters to animals expressions of loneliness, artistic exercises, or genuine attachments beyond human substitute? Some say they're simply symbolic, like writing to amuse. Others suggest they point to the emotional limitations of human relationships in rigid court life, where a person might confide in a squirrel because no one else truly listened. You might laugh, but think about it. A squirrel doesn't judge, doesn't gossip, doesn't interrupt. It just exists near you. Warm, fluffy, present. That kind of companionship, quiet and constant, is easy to fall in love with in the gentlest sense of the word. Interestingly, the rise of pet-directed letters may have briefly overlapped with the growing popularity of epistolary romance, the idea of storytelling through letters. Some believe that writing to squirrels even influenced the practice of writing as if to absent lovers. Emotional rehearsal, but with whiskers. As you lie there tonight, maybe with a soft plush or an old blanket close to hand, imagine writing a little letter to something that can't answer you back, but hears you anyway. That's the kind of love that needs no reply. 3 quiet giggles before you dream. Dear Squirrel, I spilled my secrets again? Sorry. Also, please stop hiding figs in my shoes. If your deepest emotional connection is with a woodland creature who chews furniture, you're not alone. Medieval nobles did it first. When you write a breakup letter to your ex, but keep sending poetry to your squirrel, that's called emotional priorities. You're sitting on a faded cushion in the corner of an aging manor. The tapestries are worn. The fire crackles softly. Somewhere outside, the world is changing quickly, noisily, and without waiting for permission. You look down to your lap, expecting a soft flick of a tail, a warm little body curled into your sleeve. But it's empty. The squirrel is gone. Tonight we close the tale with a gentle farewell to a time when squirrels were companions performers, muses, currency chaos, and confidants. Their golden age in the courts of medieval Europe had come to an end, not with a bang, but with a quiet shift of attention. A new era had arrived, and with it, new favorites, dogs with pedigrees, cats with smug self-assurance, and parrots that could talk back. By the late 15th century, squirrels had begun to vanish from inventories of noble households. Where once scribes recorded one red squirrel with ribboned collar, they now noted lapdog of Venetian breed, or talking bird gifted by ambassador. Not because squirrels did anything wrong, but because tastes changed. And unfortunately, squirrels never learned to sit still for portraits without chewing something important. The decline wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, like the fading of a fashion. As castles grew larger and more structured, as etiquette became more rigid, the squirrel's unpredictability became less charming and more inconvenient. Their tiny claws, once celebrated for agility, began scratching the wrong furniture. Their sudden leaps, once delightful, now risked upsetting the elaborate trays of sugared fruits. And then came the rise of the exotic. As Europe expanded its global trade routes, nobles began to acquire more impressive pets: monkeys from North Africa, birds from the East Indies, and purebred animals with long family histories. Compared to a red squirrel that might bury nuts in your shoe, a talking parrot felt like a status upgrade. Some final holdouts clung to their squirrels. A few elderly widows in the Low Countries reportedly kept squirrels until the 1520s, treating them like tiny husbands, quiet, nosy, and slightly judgmental. But even these became stories whispered in back halls, quaint, slightly embarrassing reminders of an older, fuzzier time. And so, the squirrel, once a favorite of queens and jesters alike, slipped away from the throne room and back into the treetops. It returned to its natural rhythms, nibbling bark, leaping between branches, stuffing cheeks for winter. No more collars. No more embroidered pouches. Just forest and sky. But perhaps that's not a tragedy. Maybe it was a release. Because squirrels were never really made for courts and cages. They were wild things that tolerated our affection for a while, taught us joy, mischief, patience, and the occasional need for a lint brush, and then left when they'd had enough. Historians look back and ask, why did squirrels disappear from aristocratic life so completely, so quietly? Some say the plague changed everything. Others argue it was simply the evolution of fashion and formality. Still others point to changing ideas about nature, less mystical, more scientific. The squirrel, once a symbol of balance and diligence, became just a rodent again in the eyes of those who had once adored it. But we know better, don't we? As you lie there tonight, safe and still beneath your blanket, imagine a squirrel sitting on a windowsill, high in a tower, watching as the court bustles below, unseen, unimpressed. Maybe it chitters once. Maybe it remembers. Or maybe it just leaps, vanishing into the branches beyond the castle wall, free at last. 3 final chuckles before we say goodbye. Squirrels didn't get canceled. They just ghosted medieval society. Where did all the squirrels go? Is still a better question than why does this royal dog wear shoes? History forgot squirrels. But squirrels definitely didn't forget history. They're still judging us from the trees. And now, the candle burns low, casting soft shadows that stretch like breath across your room. You've wandered through echoing halls and secret gardens, lingered in feast chambers, and whispered prayers in quiet chapels, all with a squirrel, perched near nestled close, or watching from the pages of time. They weren't just companions. They were flickers of wild memory darting between nobility and nonsense. They brought delight trouble and the occasional chewed lace, but they mattered. And that's the heart of this story. Not acorns or collars, but how something brief, bright and gentle, could find shelter inside the architecture of history. Because love doesn't need a crown. Sometimes it rustles in your sleeve. Sometimes it scrambles up your curtain. And sometimes, just sometimes, it lingers past the echo of the feast in poems' carvings, or a smile shaped like fur. So, if tonight you sense a presence by the sill, or catch a rustle in your sheets, maybe it's not a dream. Maybe it's a story, circling back to say hello. And as your breath slows, your limbs soften, and your thoughts begin to float, remember this: you've welcomed something small and half forgotten, a spark of absurd joy made real again. That's the story. For tonight, may your dreams be filled with wonder and peace. Because love doesn't need a throne. Sometimes it curls up in a velvet pouch. Sometimes it leaps onto the table mid-ceremony. And sometimes, just sometimes, it lingers long after the banquet ends in a letter, a carving, or a memory wrapped in fur. So, if tonight you feel a little closer to that squirrel perched outside your window, or if you imagine a tiny red face peeking from your blanket's fold, maybe that's not imagination at all. Maybe it's just history waving goodnight. And as your breath softens, your limbs grow still, and your thoughts begin to drift. Know this: you've made space for a forgotten wonder, for something soft, sweet, and slightly ridiculous to live again, if only for a night. That's the story. For tonight, may your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.